we actually know each other mostly through reading each other's work, which I greatly admire. I don't know if he admires mine, I admire his. He's actually one of these generalists. He specializes in many things, but not one in particular. His book on, which again was my first introduction to participatory budgeting, was really through his work. But since then, he roams around. He's like a gypsy, a vagabond. He goes here and there. Recently, I read a piece by him, also on political ethnography, which I found really quite splendid. I learned a lot from. And I don't want to take up his time, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos, for organizing this, and thanks. I know that people commute distances out of here sometimes, and I appreciate the effort that this is. It's very nice to come up a few blocks from NYU and enter for me what I think of as a very different world, which I appreciate a lot. I'm always, every time I'm in the new school, I feel a little bit emotional. No, it's a very it provokes emotions. I'm sorry. Yeah, and also by way of introduction, I have the flu, I think. Anyways, I took a lot of cold medicine.
And you sit far away.
I'm not going to breathe on anybody. But I'm having a hard time hearing. I'm all congested, so please bear with that and any extra confusion I may bring to the thing today. So today I was going to present part of a book. The book is called Democracy in Motion, and we've just turned it in. It's co-authored with a Spanish colleague of mine named Ernesto Ganuza. And that book is an ethnographic account of the travel of participatory budgeting from Brazil to the U.S. and from Brazil to Spain. And it's a kind of, we talk about it as a non-gold standard ethnography, and we can talk about that in the sense that to do an ethnographic account of a thing like that, we actually think you have to be many places, and it's a kind of follow the things sort of account more than immersion in one place. That also emerges, of course, out of my long involvement with participatory budgeting. The study that Carlos alluded to was something my dissertation on. Then I did a couple of subsequent research projects, and we tried to intervene in some of those debates in Brazil, particularly about how to implement participatory budgeting. And I've been involved at the implementing end in the United States also. And I was very involved in the implementation of the Chicago participatory budgeting process in 2009, which was the first one. So the book, that's the book, and the book tries to make some sense of this participatory budgeting story, which is a kind of interesting one. And here I'm going to present the normative, kind of accent on the normative part of it, where we propose a framework for thinking about participatory democracy based on this study. And we try to promote, try to present a specific kind of counterfactual. Again, we can talk about the study itself. The part I'm going to present sort of runs through a few of the chapters. And anyway, since the book is not going to come up for a little while, it's the thing that we actually welcome feedback on. The other stuff, please don't tell us if we're wrong. But this part, we're actually interested. So the travel of participatory budgeting is actually a pretty remarkable story. We trace this in the book in some detail. It's a very simple idea. The kind of nugget of it is that ordinary citizens should have a say over public budget that impacts them. It started in one city in Brazil. We talk a little bit about the competing paternity or maternity stories about it. It had a kind of shaky start back in 1989, 1990, and then it succeeded in one city. Then it was replicated and adapted in Brazil in the 1980s and 1990s, first through the Workers' Party, which was the party that put it in motion in the first place. But then as the 90s went on, non-governmental actors and other kinds of actors began to get involved in this process of translation and implementation in other places. So by the late 1990s, this is happening in hundreds of places throughout Latin America. And in 2000s, the story becomes actually even more kind of wild. International development agencies became involved in appreciating, promoting, making it into a set of best practices. And so, including, of course, the involvement of the World Social Forum, not an NGO, but the sort of ultra-globalization networks as well. So if you look at the 2000s, it's a pretty wild picture of who is promoting participatory budgeting. So the Chavez government adopts it as national policy at the same time as USAID is promoting it very heavily in the Andes. The World Bank Institute develops a training companion. At one point in the 2000s, I got to be part of a discussion that became a distance learning program for people in Africa, in various countries in Africa. You can listen to this radio show and take some courses online on how to do it. The Labour government in Britain also involved it. And of course, by 2009, 2010, it arrived in a big way in North America, completing sort of interesting arc. By that time, there were 1,500 different cities that were doing it, probably. So there's lots of kind of sociologically and anthropologically interesting parts of the story. But here I'm going to begin with one that I think is crucial for us, which is how this thing became so adaptable. It's seemingly absolutely adaptable to all kinds of contexts, and is completely politically polyvalent. There's an organization in Britain, the Participatory Budgeting Unit, and in their pages, they have a guide of how to promote participatory budgeting for your local official. And you can click on, if your local official is conservative, you make the argument that participatory budgeting promotes cohesion, innovation, social entrepreneurship, and it restores trust. If your representative is a green, you could say that it's environmentally sensible, and so on and so forth. So something that begins as part of a leftist project that was successful, in particular in Brazil, at helping a leftist party achieve electoral success and gain more and more municipalities, transformed so much that by late 2000s, really, it can work in any political context. So the argument we make, and this is anchored a little bit in the methodology of science studies, is we kind of look at what travels and what doesn't. And the argument we make in the book is that there's one part that travels very, very well, which is the structure of meetings. So the participatory budgeting process in New York City has a structure of meetings that's actually quite close to the structure of meetings that you had in Porto Alegre in 1991, which is a yearly cycle, which with large assemblies where people learn about the problems. Then there's delegates who are elected who discuss the problems, and it culminates in a vote where people choose the priorities of the process. And this is sort of matched to the budgeting cycle. There's rules. The participatory budgeting rules in many places are quite similar. They favor things like inclusive deliberation, how to moderate meetings, making sure that meetings have child care, what kinds of arguments aren't allowed. So that part, which is the part that's visible, so if you showed up to Porto Alegre in 1992, that would have been the striking thing. You would have gone to a meeting like I did and be very impressed at the range of people discussing mundane matters, seemingly mundane matters, in what seemed like a very equitable setting, something that it's shocking at some level, something very attractive. It kind of touches the inner Habermas. Many people have and have a difficult relationship with sometimes, but yeah, right? So that part travels, but there's another part that didn't travel, which is the thing that connected those meetings to decision making, right? So in order for you to have the structure of meetings in the city of Porto Alegre and in the Brazilian cities that had similar versions of it, there were a number of reforms of the state that were necessary. There were reforms of the bureaucracy that were necessary. There were tax changes that were necessary. And these things are less visible. If we use the image of a pump, there's an interesting debate in development studies about bush pumps that travel from place to place. John Law, a sociologist, has an interesting thing to say about it. But basically, because the handle of a pump travels, the pipes and the less visible architecture of it may not, and we can't assume because one part travels that the other goes. So part of what we're wanting to do in the book is to think about the less visible part and kind of bring it to light and think about what its importance is, and then think about what kinds of participatory democracy we want to advocate for as activists. So that's the overall gist of it. So what I'll do is I will talk a little bit about the two parts, the visible and the less visible part. We talk about the visible part as the communicative dimension of participatory budgeting, so the rules of engagement, structure of meetings. And the other part, we're going to talk about the sovereign dimension, which is what links those meetings to the centers of decision making. What makes that closer and closer to people being able to regulate the conditions of their own participation as opposed to only participate in a meeting whose rules are set by someone else. We can certainly also, so that'll be what I'll talk about given the time we have. And certainly I can talk about some of the ethnographic components and some of the tension as this thing lands in this reduced form in different places. So let me talk about the two parts. So I said the communicative dimension and the sovereign dimension. To disaggregate this, of course, is to betray the people who came up with this in the first place. So when I was in the city of Porto Alegre, I did interviews with the people who thought of this, and if I went back to them and said, well, let's separate what you wanted to do into these two different parts, that would make no sense. For them, for the radical democratic project, or the leftist project that they were trying to advance, the communication without the sovereignty doesn't mean anything. And sovereignty without this democratic communication is also less meaningful to them. And I'll say a thing or two. Yeah, and I think it's important also for us to separate this a little bit, and we can talk about this in the discussion also. We're advocating in this book a position of some agnosticism. Many of us who did participation studies or wrote about participatory budgeting for a long time, we are, anthropologists would call us ontologically complicit. We would go to the meetings, and we would sit with the people who designed the meetings, and we would love them for doing these great meetings. And you can put this on the internet. In retrospect, I think that was a mistake. I think having some critical distance from what we were studying and advocating for might have been more useful. Okay, so the communicative dimension of it. So again, as I've said, and I'm sure people here are familiar with what participatory budgeting is, it's this idea that people decide on a public budget. Some government official makes a decision to set aside part of a budget. And there's a cycle of meetings for people to identify problems, learn about the rule making. So for example, if you participated in this, you would have to learn. You can't, one of the things that people in poor neighborhoods in Brazil want all the time is they want traffic lights. You can't have traffic lights too close. People want streets. The gradient of a street by Brazilian law needs to be less than 7% in order for you to be able to pave it. So you need to learn about the rules and the bureaucratic rules. So you identify problems, you learn about the rules, you spend some time crafting demands for your neighborhood. There's a set of delegates who are elected from among the general participants who work on developing these projects. Then there's a forum at the end where people, if you've been to the New York participatory budget or the Chicago one, there is something like that in the Brazilian and Latin American ones. There's kind of a final festive day where there'll be lots of projects presented, so people may vote for some roads of paving, or a school, a community center, different kinds of projects. And then there's a kind of vote, and then there's a formula for turning those votes into a proportion of the budget. There is a lot, and I won't spend too much time on it, but essentially, the people who designed participatory budgeting and who spent time working on it were very, very influenced and very connected with traditions of thinking have to do with deliberation, with theory. So a lot of the procedures were meant to increase inclusiveness. So, for example, it's very important that people be able to learn the rules in an equitable way. As you know, popular education, kind of Paulo Freire style stuff comes from Brazil. So there's a lot of effort at being able to translate these technical rules in an understandable way. The deliberation needs to happen in a way so that men and women, for example, are able to speak equally. There's effort at the moderating to keep the technical level of discussion accessible to all. There's a lot of effort at keeping the intensity of participation. So one thing that all participatory budgets in the world do is they count who participates, how representative is this of the neighborhood, are people of color participating, are less educated participating, are people outside of political parties participating. And then there's a lot of attention to making the deliberation and discussions pretty democratic. Are people free to argue and open new avenues of discussion, and so on and so forth. So this dimension and this set of concerns has traveled pretty widely. And I don't mean to be dismissive of the importance of this dimension. But there's another one which didn't travel. And it's interesting to think about why it didn't. If you ask people involved, so the participatory budgeting became a best practice in 1997 by UN Habitat. USAID begins to really like it in the early 2000s. And if you talk to the people involved in sending those projects, those organizations for consideration, one of the things they will tell you is that the other part is too complicated to make it travel. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of Brazilian cities did was change the taxation structure on certain kinds of goods that were sold in the city as a way to increase revenue. There is no immediate cognate of that in different systems. Brazilian municipalities are relatively autonomous compared to some other Latin American countries. So there's a lot of kind of they will tell you that the technical stuff a person from Brazil can't really, it is difficult to abstract. Some people will tell you that it makes it more palatable to not include those other components because sometimes they imply changes that are too big and it seems too insurmountable. We sort of divide these institutional features into three. So one is we call it a kind of conveyor belt feature. We actually don't have a good term for it in English, but we call it an exclusive conveyor belt, which is this. One of the features is that decisions made at those meetings in the original participatory budgeting that we described, there's a kind of conveyor belt that protects the chain of popular sovereignty all the way to the state. It's actually almost literally impossible for there to be interference once the decisions are made. And another part that's really important is that there are almost no other ways to make demands on the state. We think this is actually a pretty important feature. So a participatory budgeting would have meant something else if there were 5 ways for you to get what you wanted. If you could go to a meeting and have your deliberative procedure, which takes a long time, but if you could also call your city councilor and you could also lobby and you could also do something else, it reduces the meaningfulness of that space. So one thing in the city of Porto Alegre, which in other cities repeated this, is that was a nearly sacred rule. There were no other ways to make demands on the city budget. Friend or foe, social movement, union, conservative, rich person, poor person, there was simply no other way. So this is one thing that makes it very important. Second, the bureaucracy was absolutely transformed in the city of Porto Alegre and in the cities, many cities in Brazil that adopted it. We call these bureaucratic participatory reforms. So if you think about, or I'll give you an experience from the city of Chicago, the Department of Public Works in Chicago is not set up to accept participatory inputs. It's simply not set up to, it doesn't work that way. Yes, and so the technical staff and the engineers are completely puzzled because it's their job to propose projects. Projects that come up this way are usually not part of a master plan. They make no sense, actually, from a strategic planning point of view. People want all kinds of stuff.
The projects that come through participatory.
Yes. Yeah, they absolutely, traditional departments are not set up for that. So what do they do in the city of Porto Alegre? A couple of things. One is they had a lot of training with the kind of street level bureaucrats that were involved with this process. And they designated facilitators, paid staff, whose job was to connect the Department of Water and Sanitation to these meetings. That was their only job. So they spent a lot of time explaining these procedures. They spent a lot of time helping people compose projects. And they spent a lot of time dealing with the actual engineers. So on one hand, there was a real decentralization. Like municipal departments that were not built to do this were really transformed. On the other hand, all of these participatory inputs were centralized. So it was a kind of double move. They created a bureaucracy in the city government that was responsible for keeping all of these participatory inputs sort of on track and going from there directly to the executive. To give you an idea, if one neighborhood is demanding sewage and someone else is demanding electricity and pavement and they're right next door, that doesn't make sense. But that's how municipal departments work. And then once you take away their master plan, it completely confuses them. So there's a real thorough reworking of city government to do that. In addition, a tremendous amount of money was set aside. In the early years of participatory budgeting in the city of Porto Alegre, there were protests by participants asking for higher property tax rates, for example, to fund these projects. In other words, there's a huge, huge institutional investment. And finally, another feature that didn't travel and that is not talked about very much, we call the Forum of Forums, which is an instance where participants get to reorganize the rules of the process and think about the terms of their own participation. You know, it's a kind of like constitutional moment. In reality, this may not have worked as well as it could have in every instance, but in principle, cities that did this under the Workers' Party in Brazil in the 1990s had a moment where representatives from participants would say and discuss how much of the city budget actually is to be decided by them. There was a commission that approved raises for municipal employees. People changed the rules all the time. It's interesting, I mean, sort of side comment. In the city of Porto Alegre, this changed a lot over 10, 15 years. But the structure of meetings that has traveled is actually sort of frozen. And one of the reasons we think is because it's missing that moment of people being able to change the terms of their own participation. So we think having both this kind of sovereign dimension and communicative dimension was what it made it particularly appealing and interesting set of institutional reforms. As I said, it was the place where all had to participate, and the only way to interface the state primarily was through these meetings. So this had a sort of transformative effect in the civic culture or in the participatory culture of the city. This forum of forums was able to consistently introduce social justice criteria and redistributive criteria. So as the process went on, it wasn't just a neutral process of where should we put a road, but it was a self-conscious and legitimate by the population process of redistributing resources. By the year 2002, 2003, there are very clear rules that for every dollar that went into the city, to the rich neighborhood, 3 or 4 went to the poorest neighborhoods. And this was something participants themselves decided. So if with the communicative, we asked about the intensity, how democratic and how inclusive the participation were, here we ask, I think, counterfactual questions also. First, how the primacy of these forums. So how important were these forums in terms of overall decision-making in the city? Second question we ask is, what is the scope and importance of budget issues that are subject to participation? Right? It's very nice to have participation, but if participation is over 1% of a portion of the discretionary budget, that means one thing. If it's 15% of the overall city budget, it's something else. What is the actual participatory power of the budget? That is, when we talk about the conveyor belt. Once decisions are made, how binding are those on the actual workings of the state? And finally, to what extent do people have the right to self-regulate and change the terms of their own participation? I'll say a couple of, man, this camera is really making me, I'll say a couple of sober things about the...
It films Carlos.
So a couple of things about the halfway version of the only meetings version, traveling. So one of the things we did was we looked at national patterns in Europe where this was adopted, for example. And by and large, not only did only the communicative dimension travel, most of the instances we found, its link to actual state institutions is pretty tenuous. In many, many instances, participatory budgets in England, in Germany, for example, are over very small portions of the budget. And on top of that, there's additional set of discretion. So, for instance, in England, they have participatory budgets in some cities over social service projects, with social service project, and they're 10, 15,000 pounds. Which is very, very little in terms of the kinds of budgets that are in question. We found also that participatory budgeting was implemented throughout Europe as part of administrative reforms and primarily as a way to bring citizens closer to government. The rhetoric of social justice, redistribution, transformation, all but disappears. And, you wind up with a kind of traveling best practice that has a very contingent and small link to state institutions. That said, we don't dispute that these are potentially important spaces for participation. And, for example, we find interesting things happening in some of France and Germany, for example, where there's a lot of attention to the incorporation of immigrants in these participatory spaces, which is an otherwise more difficult thing to talk about. But we'll say a few things about the dangers, I think, of just a communication-only version from the point of view of a progressive project. First, participation can actually become disconnected from decisions that matter most to communities. So one interesting thought exercise you can do, you can ask community activists, or you can ask people, or you can ask progressive movements, what are the decisions that matter most to you? In New York City, for example, it might be whoever's telling the cops what to do is actually a decision that we should have control over. It's education. It's many different kinds of things, but it could be you wind up actually setting up, with a lot of effort, a participatory process over things that are not the most important. There was a kind of a discussion you have when you implement these processes, that there's this idea that of low-hanging fruit. I had a heck of a time translating this to Spanish. To Ernesto, I was like, what is this fruit people keep on talking about? But the idea is that there's some budgets that are easier to do this with and that nobody cares about. So in the city of Chicago, we worked on the menu money, which is $1 million each city council has discretion over. But it's by definition a budget that's unimportant, right? A second worry that we have is that participation itself becomes a kind of solution, kind of technical solution to problems, as opposed to a political method of emancipation. We worry about participation becoming depoliticized in that way. Finally, in this way, there's a huge degree of discretion over participation. So in many instances that we know about, these participatory processes are done at a kind of discretion of a politician or a city councilor. Some community groups work on it. There's a tremendous amount of discretion on the part of the person who's giving or setting up this participatory space, and we worry about that. Finally, we ask, and we talk a little bit in the book about participatory budgeting as a transformative reform, which is, one of the things that many community activists that we talked to when this was implemented said was, we actually don't care about $1 million in Chicago. This is very little, but this is a tool for organizing, this is a tool for building citizen power, this is a tool for infiltrating the bourgeois state. So maybe that could be one. We also think that participation in these terms sometimes introduces dynamics that are difficult to control. So the participation, this kind of deliberation, operates on the fiction that people are equals, right? We're going to set up a fictive space where we're going to act and talk as equals. Sometimes that's difficult to contain politically. Sometimes different kinds of demands and possibilities in political projects emerge out of that. One of the ones that we see in the book, and we talk a little bit about, is sometimes there's a challenge of expert knowledge on the part of government officials. Because if you set up this process, as we're describing, you bring people talk about the common good, but you don't give them the tools or the power to transform it. Sometimes people get upset, and we actually find that meaningful and important. And so participants themselves and their utopian imaginings sometimes are, I think, were the most hopeful part of it. Thanks.
Also, I have to say that maybe I spent too much of my graduate training reading about new institutional organizational theory and new institutionalism, but I couldn't help thinking about John Mayer's article about formal structures, myth, and ceremony. And, so, if I have that in my mind, I kind of understand why the communicative part travels, right? As myth and ceremony, there's the substantive parts really don't transfer. So this is not so much of a practical issue, but an issue about power relations, right? So only the myth and ceremony, like this kind of more insubstantial features covered down, because this is what serves power interests best, and then the substantive parts don't. So maybe, as you said earlier, that you didn't take enough critical distance at the time of starting working on this. Maybe it's a little bit like that. You explain the diffusion process.
Yeah. So the interesting thing we talk about that piece a little bit in the book. So we think, the diffusion process is kind of interesting because there's 2 or 3 networks doing it at the same time. So there's a best practice version that is traveling through international development agencies. And and
So they're funding.
they're funding it. So they'll fund the study, then they will distill a best practice, then they'll make a toolkit, then they will help someone and they'll fund the implementation of a toolkit. So for example, in Peru, the participatory budgeting arrives through USAID in large part. And USAID very much is doing a kind of watered down version in that way. So for sure that's part of it. But then there is a kind of alter globalization, World Social Forum kinds of activists who meet in Porto Alegre in 2001, 2, 3, and then they go to Spain, the leaders of the Trotskyist part of the Workers' Party, meet with their comrades in Spain. So there's that kind of alternative network too, and they also wind up not disseminating the other part. And when we talk to them, like I understand why the USAID version doesn't, that's not surprising, but why would the city of Cordoba, which was under leftist administration, consulting directly with the leftists in Porto Alegre, why did they not do it? And then the account they give is in practical terms, in that they'll say things like, well, we don't yet have the movement capacity to do this kind of transformative project that you're implying by all these changes. And the city of Cordoba, in fact, is sort of a failed case, because they tried to do it for a few years and it actually failed, and that was a powerful demonstration, in fact, for the other cities in Spain that then went with a more reduced version. So for us, we talk about the productive power of ambiguity. So when this thing lands, you have all these parties, more conservative, less civic-minded, alter globalization, and everybody kind of postpones their desires a little bit. Everyone is thinking that this thing is going to do different things for them. So some people think, well, we start with this little budget, and it's going to build and build and build, and people get a taste for participation, and then all of a sudden we're going to replicate. And then, of course, that hasn't happened or didn't happen in most places. So for us, it's a kind of diffusion and actor story, but a kind of translation on the ground is also pretty important.
Yeah, okay, I have two questions. One of them is about, just following up on that, whether there was a place where it actually sort of succeeded in translating into a transformative project that was expected in Cordoba. And I'm wondering, I don't know anything about this, so forgive my ignorance, but maybe what the conditions were in Porto Alegre that allowed, to me it just seems totally normal that, of course, a state is not set up to receive these kinds of demands or suggestions from this kind of grassroots thing. So I'm wondering what was happening in Brazil that made that possible to begin with, and then whether it's been actually successfully, in your view of what successful is, kind of translated elsewhere. And I also, we might have to turn the camera on for this, but I'm also just curious for you to say a little bit more about, why you would have liked a more critical approach in the sort of, your initial forays into this, into these spaces and so on. So I think there's a couple things happening in Brazil at the time. So it's a kind of social movement party that this is the period right after the transition to democracy. So everything was kind of up for experimentation. Raul Ponte was one of the early mayors in Porto Alegre, said, we didn't have a tradition of deliberation like in Switzerland. So we just have to reinvent everything. There was a sense that everything was up for kind of reshuffling. And we try not to, I try not to have the story about, we try to be open to the possibility that other kinds of political configurations could wind up with this result. We definitely don't want to argue that because it was a movement and a progressive party that did it, that you need that in particular. It's hard to imagine exactly how that would happen, but there's no. We don't want to make the argument that we have to replicate those very particular pieces. And as far as
I don't know. A lot of people. A lot of people. I'm part of a generation of people who did participation studies, and who did participatory budgeting studies, and it's pretty remarkable how similar kind of our take on all of it was. And I think for me in particular, and I hope I'm not offending anybody in the room, it was the Workers' Party itself in national power turning a little bit away from that vision of participation was a kind of first wake-up call. The city of Porto Alegre, of course, changed mayors and political direction really radically in 2004, and that mayor has run very, very conservative administration with the participatory budgeting. There's a fascinating World Bank study that shows that that administration has done a terrible job at honoring the popular input, for example. So those kinds of, I suppose, we put a lot of faith in what participation could do. So, creatures of the moment, I guess.
In New York City, it's the discretionary funds from each city council member that's participating. Is there, we talked a little bit about the issue of what is meaningful in participatory amount of money that the budget needs to be. Is there a tipping point that makes it more meaningful than others?
Oh, I don't know. But one thing that's very exciting here in New York is there's discussion of participatory decision-making around NYCHA funds.
Around?
Yeah,
Around what?
NYCHA funds, the housing, public housing.
Okay, that's cool.
And that would directly affect people's lived conditions. If you could redirect how NYCHA directs some of its funds in the way that's directed. So that's not a percentage answer, but that would be meaningful.
That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I'll ask the second question after that.
None of those.
No, I think I would like to go back. I'm Brazilian. I entered school in a time where everybody in political science was studying the case of participatory budgeting. My first experiences as a researcher was there. I was also a delegate in the experience of participatory budgeting in São Paulo. And I just, in this travel, this geographic but also academic travel, because one thing I think is important to understand is that participatory budgeting was not only a policy experiment or a democratic experiment, but it was also a new experiment in academia. It was a whole new topic of studies. And how, in this travel, what is the impact of this global travel of participatory budgeting when it comes back to Brazil? Maybe this is a boring question for those who don't study Brazil, but I see the moment today, and there's a lot of people in social science in Brazil arguing that there is a saturation of the discourse on participatory budgeting, giving a lot of criticism on co-optation, the power that it has not to educate social movement, to de-educate by getting the leaderships and putting them in government, the problems of deliberation, the ones that you mentioned. It's a very tiny part of the budget who goes for it. Participatory budget tends to radicalize the debate instead of making it into a more Habermasian, let's change opinions and change government. So, and it has to do with the saturation of the Workers' Party in general. Like we had a main crisis last year with the government not being able to implement this major decree on social participation that would institutionalize participation as a way of making public policy, and the government didn't manage to do that. And it's still a Workers' Party government. And also in the international development discourse, I think also growing up an academic and doing that, everybody was like, oh, you study participatory budget, come tell us this story. And even being in São Paulo, everybody who would come, all these international agencies would be very interested in knowing what people are doing. And we're not doing anything great, but anyways. And I think I feel there is a change in discourse in international development from this height of participatory policies and methods to a focus on education. And you need to first educate civism to people. It's a very personal feeling of what I've been reading recently. On the focus now is on human development, is on human resource. You have to educate people first so that they can participate in a better condition. So these are two different sets of thoughts.
No, these are great ones. I mean, so one of the things we talk about is some of the debate about participation absolutely has shifted to that. It went from participation for accomplishing X, Y, or Z to participation isn't as an end to itself in its educative and civic component. So a huge portion of studies today defend and talk about participation in those terms. So I absolutely agree with it. I feel like it has changed. I feel like the literature has actually gotten very, very critical, very, very critical, in Brazil, we're extremely critical now. There's a kind of criticism of participation as a kind of synonym of neoliberalism that is very present in some quarters. Also, no, absolutely, and I think I was just at a dissertation defense as someone in Brazil trying to look at the diffusion from a Brazilian point of view. Yeah, I think people in Brazil don't know if to when they look at the international experiences, if to distance themselves from it in view of it and promote what we're trying to do here, defend one version of a model, or if they're dismissive entirely. I mean, there's a saturation of participation in Brazil also. I mean, Brazil is such a participatory country. I was joking with somebody from IPEA, which is a research institute, that someone should do a study and count the number of hours people go to meetings in Brazil and calculate that as a drag on the economy. Because there's so many meetings. Every city in Brazil has a health council. Every city in Brazil has so many other councils. There's national conference. A tremendous amount of investment in participation. I agree with it, and I think it's important to. I think part of what we're trying to do is sort of position ourselves and figure out what do we do, but I think that the second thing is this reflection and, what has it meant and what can we learn from this arc, because it's absolutely an arc from celebration to very sharp criticism. And a final thought that. This was true in São Paulo, but in other cities in Brazil also. The international relations department of many municipalities in Brazil began with participatory budgeting. So City of São Paulo had an international relations department that grew out of participatory budgeting because they were receiving so many people, and people were going on so many trips to talk about participatory budgeting.
Yeah, we just actually there are several students here from this course on neoliberalism that we're all wrestling with, and we had quite a row today, if I can call it that. Very enlightening, I hope. And one of the issues, I think it's a continuity of this discussion, and it has to do with, and let me first pose it as a question and then probe a little bit. The question is, can sociology study politics? Is it possible? The fancier question. And in hearing you talk, it seems to me that you have two responses. One is the response of politics as a social fact, which is really the way sociology studies politics, as a social fact. And then you have the other response, which is politics as performative, as the constitution of the new, which doesn't and can't be understood by reducing it to a prior instance or by working from the axiom of inequality. And in your account, I hear both versions. And I'm wondering if you can help us think through what are the implications. First of all, if this is a fair rendition of what you're saying, but then if it is, if you can help us think through what are the implications of both approaches for your work.
Wow.
25 words or less.
I'm going to give you my Twitter answer. And what was the fight in your class?
Well, Professor Forment,
Oh.
well, no, I mean, I feel like that, well, okay, so we were looking at like at the Sarah Babb and Marion Foucault article that was comparing like 4 different cases of implementation of neoliberalism, and you know, there was the observation made that they were kind of taking an institutionalist perspective to kind of understand these 4 different cases, and it was brought up that that is problematic, you know, like for example to group like Chile and Great Britain together.
Because of the institution, I mean, lay out the argument.
But, because of it, so they were taking kind of explicitly like an institutional, they were taking like explicitly an institutional lens and saying, you know, these were 2 groups of intellectuals that were on the periphery, that were coming in, and we were kind of making the point, well, the political context in which these 2 intellectual groups were coming in and implementing neoliberal policy were very different in Chile and in Great Britain. And then the argument was kind of made that method invisibilizes politics was kind of what was essentially made, in that by focusing on the institutionalist dimension of like these 2 implementations of neoliberalism, you weren't looking at the deeper political context, and the fundamental one being that in, you know, Chile, neoliberalism was, you know, implemented in the context of an extremely authoritarian state that was killing people, which is just wasn't happening in Great Britain. And so that
we know.
Right, but definitely at this level, and just in terms of level of dead, we know that it was happening in a way in Chile that it wasn't happening in Great Britain. So, a focus on a specific methodological component, like just looking at the institutional dimension, is going to completely invisibilize any ability to see the underlying political dimensions.
Yeah, that imagine if you began this study not by looking at the argument that they make, which is, it's an admirable article. I want to start with this. I mean, it's not a trivial argument. So they begin from the premise of the institutional level, which again is a very important level. I don't deny this. But what would happen if you began the argument from the fact that in Santiago, the central stadium is where you killed roughly 3,000 persons, whereas in London, you didn't have a central stadium where you began killing people? What are the implications of then following out this analysis of starting the article from the stadium versus starting the article from the institutions? And therefore, I don't want to repeat, because this is a discussion that went on it's very elaborate, and it was quite, we were very engaged, and there was intricacies, and there were, so on and so forth. But the point being that it seems to me that Rancière is onto something. That method invisibilizes, it also enables you to see some things. I don't deny that. But it does invisibilize what I think, to me, is what I'm most interested in, is the politics. Politics understood as performative, as the emergence of the new. How do you disconnect the present and the future from the past? And there you can't resort to, either variables or, pointing to another instance. And in hearing your talk, it seems to me that you did both things at once. And I'm wondering if this is deliberate, or perhaps you're critical to Rancière, which is, is perfectly, that's certainly one response. Or is there something else here that's going on that it would be interesting to just probe a little?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I hope you don't become disappointed in me as a person if I tell you the methodology.
No, that happened a long time ago.
No, so our methodological or anti methodology that we follow actually comes from actor network theory, which is we look at the political as a contingent assemblage of characters, and we look at the moments of controversy before things are solidified, and once they become solidified, we look at what travels as a sort of ready-made thing. So, I mean, we cite Rancière. I definitely we are attentive to that dimension, to the making of the new. I think we also normatively we look at Castoriadis a little bit too. We're looking at people's capacity to self-regulate, the autonomos that they're searching for. Yeah, so I think maybe it sounds like a soup of social fact and Rancière and stuff, but our methodology is to look at controversies and moments of openness. So we tell the thing kind of episodically. So when there's a controversy, we tell the story for like as controversies, then it's settled, then the thing travels, then controversies as it arrives, and we look at what settles, which is and we try to be. So in a way, we resist the institutional analysis, I suppose, because this approach is actually kind of anarchic. We are willing to consider anything as part of the mix of things. And so the political stuff that you heard was actually people's understanding of the situation, political activists.
In real lifetime.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you say something, because also some of the students in the course ask, and I don't do acting, I don't understand it. In your work, how give me one example, how would this operate?
Yeah, so for example, so there is there's a descendant of that looks at they call it the politics of instruments. And they say an instrument just doesn't land from heaven, right? It arrives through specific networks of people and actors who bring it together, and then people align around it, and the instrument has its own effects. So here's a specific way that this plays out. By looking at it this way, looking at the alignment of people who at various points kind of organize around participatory budgeting, make it travel, and sort of define it in a certain way, this is neoliberalism becomes a story of a kind of co-production as opposed to an imposition. So in the city of Chicago, when somebody could say, look, this is neoliberalism, and you have, Jamie Peck, for example, talks about neoliberalism means policies travel in bits and pieces, and there's powerful actors in it, but it all conforms to this logic. Our version of story in Chicago is actually contingent. The thing lands, people sign up for it, and they work for it, and they co-produce a thing that winds up being pretty reduced. And someone could come later and say, this looks like neoliberalism. We tell the story of the contingent putting it together.
That it can, but it doesn't necessarily have to end up that way.
And so this is the Rancière thing that you heard, maybe, like the emphasis on agency and roads not taken and people's imaginings of, different possibilities. What else? What do you have to say?
No, I was curious. It's a kind of goes back to his question as well. I was just curious to understand a little bit more how. Two questions then. So the first one is a little bit more simple, I guess, to some extent, which is, how do you see the traveling within Brazil before going out, and whether or not this changes when the actors also try to spread out from Brazil elsewhere? And then the second question is, and it goes back to your point about ANT or ANAT, which is some of the authors within this strain of literature emphasize that it's not only theory about actor and network coming together in a sort of specific constellation of articulations, but actually there's two hyphens, it's actor, network, and theory all together. And then theory in this case means the expertise that travels together, right?
Right.
So in this sense, how would you describe the field? How would you describe the battles for the right version of participatory budgeting? How the vision of what it is impacts how it travels?
Yeah, well, the second one just answered itself.
Okay.
But I think that's right. So I think, so it connects to the first part. So in Brazil, we see a couple of stages. Again, so one city, actually a lot of city governments were elected in the Workers' Party in 1992. And the 1992 to 1996, people describe as a period of shock with reality for the Workers' Party. Out of 36 cities got elected, only 12 managed re-election. The other 12, the mayors actually were kicked off from the party or left the party because the controversies were so strong. And these were cities that implemented other kinds of processes of participation, more anchored in sectoral participation. So councils where unions and movements come together as opposed to the open process emphasizing the unorganized. So the participatory budgeting wins that first trial. And in 1996, there's a forum, Forum Nacional FNPP, that codifies a kind of recipe. So 1996 onwards, a lot of Brazilian cities implement a fairly codified version with people from Porto Alegre and São Paulo. What happens in the late 90s is that it becomes, within Brazil, politically polyvalent. Other parties begin to do it. I did a study with Patrick Heller and Marcelo Silva, where we looked at cities that had participatory budgeting 97 to 2000. And we did a very fancy thing, like regression discontinuity and all this stuff. We found identical cities in Brazil, one that had participatory budgeting and one that didn't, for this time period to compare them. Of course, we could not find a single city in Brazil that didn't have participatory budgeting. So when we landed in the city without it, they said, oh, but we also do it. So everybody was doing some kind of participation in the late 90s. And then it jumps. But there's a qualitative shift in the thing when it goes international in 2000. There's a kind of like further reduction. The version that travels in Brazil includes some of the institutional reforms. There's a fair amount of emphasis on changes. So in Brazil in the 90s, a lot of cities are introducing new things all the time that weren't true in Porto Alegre. So youth participatory budget, strategic planning, all kinds of other stuff. But when it went international, it kind of like congealed around very simple set of principles. In the book, we talk about, speaking of international actors, in 2007, after the U.S. Social Forum, there was a meeting, the Right to the City Network, which I'm partisan of, was founded around that time. And Right to the City started promoting participatory budgeting. There were two meetings within the same year, one at the World Bank Institute and one at the Tenant and Workers in Virginia, which is the first city that did living wage in the United States, a Right to the City, talking about participatory budgeting. And we talk about the slides and the PowerPoints, and they're identical. They even the kind of the graphs and the figures are sort of the same. Yes, and so there is a kind of combat and these meetings about what should travel, and I represent the losing version. This is a loser's sour grapes. Didn't travel. Is that what you're asking?
If I can say this, I found this last example very uncanny because, so you observe these two cities, no? And you're trying to figure out, if in Buenos Aires it happened the opposite. We had this, 5 years of neighborhood assemblies, and I know this experience very well. I was actually a delegate to the National Congress for 3 years. And yet, when it came time, and there was a huge, massive, enormous effort, squandered time to implement participatory budgeting, it didn't. So it's the reverse. Whereas everybody in Brazil is into participatory Buenos Aires, which imagines and describes itself as a left city,
Right.
as a very participatory, actually was unable to, for reasons that it's a mystery to me, was not able to implement participatory budgeting except in a lukewarm, it's kind of like this trashy way. That's nonsense. Have you ever wondered, sort of the reverse question?
Yeah, I have. I don't have an answer. I've heard the case of Buenos Aires. I've heard it described just like that.
Yeah, it's not terribly, and it's a puzzle because listen, the assemblies are like Podemos in fact, we met with a lot of Podemos people prior to becoming Podemos. We had one of these networks. We went back and it was great because they would fly me to Madrid all the time, and so you had the similar kind of network. And yet now in Madrid, my understanding is that they have this.
Yes. Yeah, the Podemos. I don't know if you saw the Jacobin piece about the Latin American roots of Podemos. It's very interesting. Talks about Pablo Iglesias. He studied the MAS in Bolivia.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in that piece that Brazil got totally knocked down to the, during the World 2003, to be a leftist meant you paid respect to the Workers' Party achievements. Now,
Your history.
yeah, yeah. Yes.
We kind of we've been talking about this idea of multi-site ethnography,
Oh,
and so you guys please jump in. With Douglas and Zana, we were talking about it, and I feel like I haven't read as much of the literature as they have, so maybe they can interject. But we were kind of having this argument about, in a more traditional notion of ethnography, you have this idea of a site, and it's kind of the bounded nature of the site itself that allows you to achieve this task of thick description. And then it was brought up, Douglas specifically brought up this idea, well, what if the phenomenon you want to study is kind of moving in such a way that you can't be bounded by a specific site, that the only way you can understand it is to kind of move through, that geography kind of isn't a good way to bound your understanding because of the way the phenomenon moves. And I said, I understand that as a case for multi-site ethnography, but I guess the question becomes how do you bound your unit of analysis so you can still say you're kind of achieving this task of thick description? I guess maybe what's thick about it is that you're looking at all of these different moments, and so you kind of have a total understanding of the process that you wouldn't have if you were just in one geographical location. But I don't know, that's something that we are kind of puzzling over.
I very nearly gave a methods talk in here today, not about this at all, because I'm very interested in this. And there's a paper I've nearly finished with Michael Rodriguez and Diana Greisborg, where we make a case for changing the assumptions of ethnography once you move away from studying the urban poor, which is imagination inherited from the Chicago school, right? And you think about some of those assumptions. So it's a bounded, it's immersion with a small number of people. It's a bounded field site. It's about verbal interaction. And once you move to different kinds,
it's miserablist.
It is miserablist. And once you move, some of those assumptions simply don't hold. For example, there's a tremendous amount of suspicion in we call this kind of gold standard ethnography of the use of social technical devices or texts or interviews. But for example, in the world of expertise, emails are really important. That's actually where the action is. PowerPoints are tremendously important to understand this story. And, and it goes without saying that it can't be cited in a traditional sense. So the question then is but where do you stop?
Right, yeah.
In recognizing that you are one person or two people. In this paper, we look at some of the anthropologists deal with it. So,
who do you have in mind?
So Tanya Lee, Anna Singh. There's this phrase of patchwork ethnography that is used sometimes. Anthropologists are ahead of this in the kind of multi-sided. A&T gives you some clues. It says to follow the actors, and it says to think about, but A&T ultimately has an unsatisfactory answer, which is when the actors stop talking about an issue, it's settled, so it never goes outside the network. So you never get another side of an issue. So I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think that's one of the challenges. I think there's different ethical challenges. What are you studying?
Oh, well, I'm just kind of starting what I'm studying, but I'm looking at how people in kind of this rural area of Argentina deal with inflation, and like the practices they implement on a day-to-day basis that they talk about as kind of strategies to halt the way that inflation is eroding their purchasing power. So like if inflation is rising more quickly than the rate at which their salaries are rising. And like, yeah. So I guess how do people make sense of a situation in which like macroeconomic like constraints, kind of rob them of a lot of agency in economic life?
Yeah, that's important. I mean, yours is obviously a multi-sided project.
No, actually not. So it's well, I'm doing research now on the tri-border area, but I'm focusing on the special economic zone within the city of Ciudad del Este in Paraguay. But my comments on this argument we were having was that even if we try to be more loyal to what you described as a gold age ethnography or something like that, I guess I don't come from the angle of criticizing the way that ethnographies or participant observation were conducted here in the influenced by Chicago School kind of work, but more from the critique from the anthropologists that say, well, even if we go to where we thought were a naturally bounded side of observation, this is very much a Eurocentric and modernist perspective of looking to those sites and saying, well, this is naturally bounded, so we just go there, immerse ourselves and do research. But what happens then when this sort of critique comes back to either Europe or the US and say, well, what happens in more hyper-connected metropolises? Like, how do you start in a place but also allow yourself to be more open to follow the either practices or technologies or actors? So not only how a place is either, or your ethnography is either multi-sited or mobile, but also how your own field of, or your own side of observation actually has to be constantly redefined in order to you to really assess what's going on if you're looking for either practices or networks.
Yeah, and people have their own practices of making a scale or making a site. People have their own understandings of where they live, and I suppose in some instances it is bounded and small, but actually in many contexts people think of themselves as inhabiting much more expansive domains. I don't know how to limit it. I think it's a good question, but.
I was wondering if we could go back to the method to the larger question that you started with, looking at participatory budgeting as an example of participatory democracy. Right? And kind of your story is that participatory budgeting through the diffusion has been so diluted. So can you still consider this as a genuine participatory democratic practice? And also, how does it compare with some other alternative practices of participatory democracy? There are some attempts in Germany with the power party. So how does participatory budgeting compare maybe with some other practices of participatory democracy?
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think the version that travels is diluted, and the connection that it might have to the centers of decision making is a question mark wherever it lands. It doesn't mean it has to be disconnected, but it often, for most of the time, has. So for us in the book we compare it to. We ask these two sets of questions about the communication, the quality of the communication, and whether it's sovereign participation or not. So we talk about, we don't actually, we sort of leave it at that. One of the examples we talk about was that sort of talking transition we had here in New York, which was a tent where you could give opinions to somebody about the state of the city. That had I don't know if people participated in Talking Transition. It was the Open Society funded this very fancy looking transparent tent where you could go in and say what you thought was important for the mayor. It hasn't had actual follow-through as far as I know. And we talk a lot about this new. One of the things we talk about is there was actually a change from new public management and minimal government to a kind of new discourse around citizen governance and public governance and the inclusion of the citizen, which we think is distinct and which is how participatory budgeting kind of winds up being one of many things on the menu. There was a study by the National League of Cities in 2010. The percentage of municipalities in the U.S. that have something that they consider deliberative democracy is very, very high today. Participation is definitely on the agenda, but it's kind of like the participatory budgeting in the sense that it tends to be deliberative instances that are inclusive, democratic. We'll talk about the common good, but generally distanced from decision making. And one of the things we do in the book is we trace the kind of emergence of participatory democracy as a kind of radical ideal and its absorption by this new public governance discourse. So to answer your question in a very long-winded way, we didn't make those comparisons to Occupy or to the Pirate Party. We do say a couple of sentences about Podemos, which we find the things they're saying pretty exciting. But we find this general moment to be one in which these kinds of instances of a kind of participatory democracy having become a kind of discussion-based democracy without decision-making.
Following up on that, have you looked at the municipal or elsewhere, the comparison between the Allegra model, as I call it, and like the America Speaks in Washington, D.C.
Sorry,
the America Speaks budgeting process in Washington, D.C., which was very computer-based, and the federal government decided to hire them in the 90s.
Right.
And for that matter, Amy Gutman's model in Philadelphia.
No, I did find a paper that makes that comparison, actually.
Really?
Yes. There is someone who does a study of participatory budgeting in the U.S., which shockingly does not talk about participatory budgeting, but talks about things that are literally about different forms of citizen participation in the budget, including some of that kind of stuff, and including some of the interesting things like in San Francisco, there was one, what was it called? San Francisco and Eugene, Oregon also had some instances of kind of like citizen engagement in the budget. And the San Francisco one was completely fictive. It wasn't over actually any money. But as a result, it was super radical. It was people proposing, lots of money for AIDS research and quality public education and healthcare and all this kind of stuff. Because it had no budget attached. I think it's,
Yeah, I was thinking contemporary social movements tend to have a different type of relationship with the city as a commons.
yes.
And they also don't go through any bureaucratic whatever processes any longer. They change if they can. I mean, they gather their own research. I mean, we see it happening in many instances. And I'm from Turkey, so I just was thinking about it. After the Gezi movement, for instance, the resistance retreated to the neighborhoods and then started acting exactly like you described, but without any attachment to the state. And I was wondering there's this tension between the bureaucratic participatory movement and this kind of new social movements that don't want to be co-opted by these kind of state agencies or dispositives. And I was wondering if you have come across with that kind of tangent.
All the time. And in fact, one of the interesting things that's been a fascinating part of the Scrabble is that I've now met movement activists like Occupy type young people who see participatory budgeting as that, as a bureaucratic distraction from the real issues that matter, not a radical democracy. So one of the things we talk about in the book is the importance of having the commons and the public. So Alex Kalinikos makes an argument to this effect, and we think it's an interesting one, which is the radicalness of talking about the commons is really, really important. But we should not also forget the public. So the stuff that we were talking about, actually taking that radical energy of the commons and making that sovereign over our public institutions, right? I mean, if we had a radical revolution, someone would have to run the power grid and the subways and the garbage. And I feel like I worry a little bit about the commons only when it tends to look inward a lot and let go of that. Though I recognize there's a radical democraticness there.
I was actually wondering if there were bodies that intermediated between those two groups, because like once you have those in middle groups, then I mean that communicative aspect of it like functions more properly, and then the tension like reduces down, or you can like include those groups like to each other's whatever tasks or
Yes.
Fields.
Yeah, no, I definitely, so the city of New York is actually a very nice example of very, very radical community groups helping make participatory budgeting happen. And some of these groups, people very invested in this version of the commons.
Well, all good things must come to an end.
Well, thanks for your time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.